The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban streets as Samuel Johnson carefully guided his well-maintained 2010 Buick down Maple Avenue. The 78-year-old adjusted his glasses and smiled to himself, still warmed by the memory of his grandchildren's laughter. 3-year-old Ellie had insisted on one more story before he left, and 6-year-old James had proudly shown him a new model airplane he'd built. These Sunday visits were the highlight of Samuel's week. Samuel's weathered hands, marked with age spots and the subtle tremors that had begun a few years back, gripped the steering wheel at exactly 10 and 2 o'clock, just as he'd done for over 60 years of driving. He was meticulous about following traffic laws, a habit formed during his decades of military service where attention to detail had been not just expected, but essential. The peaceful drive home was interrupted by the sudden flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. Samuel felt his heartbeat quicken slightly, but he remained calm. In his long life, he'd been pulled over many times, often for reasons that seemed to have more to do with his skin color than any actual infraction. He carefully signaled, pulled to the side of the road, and turned off the engine. As he waited for the officer to approach, Samuel took a deep breath and reminded himself of what his father had taught him decades ago. Keep your hands visible, speak respectfully, and remember who you are. It was advice that had kept him safe through the civil rights era, through Vietnam, and through countless interactions in a country that hadn't always seen his full humanity. The police officer took his time approaching the vehicle, his hand resting casually near his holster. Samuel watched in the side mirror as the man swaggered toward his car, young, maybe mid-30s, with the confident stride of someone who knew his authority was rarely questioned in this affluent, predominantly white neighborhood. License and registration, the officer demanded without preamble, not bothering with the customary greeting or explanation for the stop. Yes, sir, Samuel replied evenly, his voice carrying the slight drawl of his southern upbringing. My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for it now, if that's all right. The officer, whose nameplate read Reynolds, gave a curt nod, watching with narrowed eyes as Samuel slowly opened the compartment and retrieved the documents. And may I ask why you pulled me over today, Officer Reynolds? Samuel inquired politely, handing over his license and registration with a steady hand. Reynolds barely glanced at the documents. You were driving 5 miles under the speed limit, holding up traffic. That can be just as dangerous as speeding. This is a nice neighborhood. People have places to be. Samuel knew there had been no traffic behind him, but he simply nodded. I understand, sir. Safety is important. The officer's eyebrows raised slightly at Samuel's composed demeanor. He seemed to have expected, perhaps even wanted, a different reaction. This your car, old-timer? Reynolds asked, his tone shifting from professional to condescending. Yes, sir. Bought it new in 2010. Been taking good care of it ever since. Reynolds walked around the vehicle, inspecting it with exaggerated thoroughness. And what brings you to this neighborhood? You don't look like you're from around here. The implication was clear, and it was one Samuel had heard countless times before. This neighborhood, with its manicured lawns and expensive homes, wasn't where people expected to see an elderly black man driving through, unless he was there to mow lawns or fix plumbing. I was visiting my grandchildren, Samuel explained patiently. My son Thomas and his wife live on Oak Ridge Drive. I come every Sunday afternoon. Reynolds leaned down, making direct eye contact with Samuel for the first time. Oak Ridge, huh? Those are some pretty expensive houses. Samuel met his gaze steadily. Yes, sir. My son works in hospital administration. A couple walked by on the sidewalk, slowing their pace to observe the interaction. Reynolds straightened up. Aware of the audience but not deterred. Step out of the vehicle, please, he said, his hand again drifting toward his holster in a casual but unmistakable gesture. Samuel's heart sank, but his expression remained neutral. This was the moment when these encounters often took a more troubling turn. He carefully unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, moving with the deliberate slowness of age that was sometimes mistaken for defiance. Standing upright was a challenge on good days. Arthritis had settled into Samuel's knees years ago, a souvenir from jungle warfare and decades of physical labor. Today, after sitting in a small chair playing with his grandchildren for hours, the stiffness was pronounced. He grimaced slightly as he rose to his full height. Something wrong with your legs? Reynolds asked, watching Samuel's careful movements with suspicion rather than concern. Just some old war injuries acting up, Samuel replied with a small smile. Vietnam wasn't kind to these knees. Reynolds scoffed, clearly skeptical. Vietnam, right? You got some ID to prove you're a veteran? Samuel reached for his wallet again, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. I have my VA card, sir. As he searched for the card, a silver-framed photo fell from his wallet onto the pavement. Reynolds watched with arms crossed as Samuel slowly bent to retrieve it, his joints protesting the movement. The photo showed a much younger Samuel in full military dress uniform, standing proudly beside an aircraft. Before Samuel could tuck it away, Reynolds snatched it from his hands. This supposed to be you? He asked with undisguised doubt. Yes, sir. That was taken in 1968, just before my second tour. Reynolds handed the photo back with a dismissive flick of his wrist. A lot of folks have old military photos. Doesn't prove anything. By now, more neighbors had noticed the confrontation. An older white couple slowed their walk, exchanging concerned glances. A young man stopped mowing his lawn to watch from across the street. Samuel felt their eyes on him, some curious, some concerned, a few hostile, but kept his attention focused on the officer. Sir, may I ask what this is about? Samuel's voice remained respectful but firm. I don't believe I've broken any traffic laws. I'll ask the questions here, Reynolds replied, his voice hardening. How long have you been coming to this neighborhood? What's your son's exact address? What does his wife do? The questions came rapidly, designed to trip Samuel up, to catch him in a lie that would justify the officer's suspicion. It was a familiar tactic, one Samuel had encountered before. The assumption was clear. He didn't belong here, and his presence required explanation. With patient dignity, Samuel answered each question truthfully, his voice never rising, his demeanor never changing. He shared that his son had lived in the neighborhood for 12 years, that his daughter-in-law taught chemistry at the local high school, that his grandchildren attended the elementary school 2 blocks over. With each correct, detailed answer, Reynolds's frustration seemed to grow. You seem to know a lot about the area, the officer said, his tone making it sound like an accusation rather than a compliment. I visit every week, Samuel explained simply. Have done for years. Reynolds circled back to the driver's side of the car and gestured for Samuel to follow him. Mind if I take a look inside your vehicle? It wasn't really a question, and they both knew it. Samuel knew his rights, knew he could refuse without probable cause. But he also knew the reality of being an elderly black man alone, with an increasingly agitated officer. Decades of lived experience had taught him which battles to pick. Go right ahead. Sir, Samuel said, maintaining his composure. As Reynolds began searching through the car, Samuel stood quietly by the roadside. The late afternoon had turned golden, casting a warm light over the neighborhood that contrasted with the chill of the encounter. Samuel thought about his son, about the talks they'd had when Thomas was growing up, the careful instructions on how to interact with police, the explanations of why they needed to be twice as careful, twice as polite, twice as law-abiding. The heartbreak of knowing these same conversations were now happening between Thomas and young James. Reynolds emerged from the car, clearly disappointed at finding nothing suspicious, just a small bag of hard candies for the grandchildren, a cardigan sweater for when the evening turned cool, and a worn Bible in the glove compartment. You always drive this slow? Reynolds asked, changing tactics. Because it seems suspicious, someone just cruising through the neighborhood, taking their time looking around. I drive cautiously, sir, Samuel replied. At my age, reflexes aren't what they used to be. I believe in being careful. A flicker of something, perhaps shame, perhaps just irritation, crossed Reynolds's face. He handed back Samuel's license and registration with obvious reluctance. I'm going to let you off with a warning this time, he said, as though he were being generous. But I suggest you pick up your speed a little. Driving too slowly can be as dangerous as driving too fast. Thank you, sir. I appreciate the advice. Samuel responded with the same even tone he'd maintained throughout the encounter. As he carefully lowered himself back into the driver's seat, Samuel caught sight of a woman watching intently from her front porch across the street. She was shaking her head slowly, her expression troubled. For a moment their eyes met, and Samuel gave her a small, reassuring smile. The same one he'd given countless times throughout his life when others witnessed his dignity in the face of indignity. Reynolds returned to his patrol car without another word, but remained parked behind Samuel's Buick, his presence a clear message to move along quickly. With practiced care, Samuel started his engine, signaled, and pulled away from the curb. As he drove away, his hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, not from age this time, but from the familiar mixture of relief and suppressed anger that followed these encounters. He turned on the radio to a smooth jazz station, letting the gentle saxophone soothe his nerves as he headed home. What Officer Reynolds didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to find out, was exactly who he had treated with such casual disrespect. But Samuel knew that tomorrow would bring another day, another chance to be seen for who he truly was. And perhaps if fate had its way, their paths would cross again under very different circumstances. Samuel drove only 2 blocks before he noticed the police cruiser behind him again, lights flashing once more. His heart sank. He'd done nothing wrong, had used his turn signal, had come to a complete stop at the intersection, had maintained a proper speed. With a weary sigh that came from somewhere deep in his soul, he pulled over for the second time. Officer Reynolds approached more quickly this time, his posture rigid with purpose. Samuel kept his hands on the wheel, visible and still. "Is there a problem, officer?" Samuel asked, his voice betraying no hint of the frustration building inside him. "Step out of the vehicle again," Reynolds commanded, not bothering to answer the question. "Now," Samuel complied, moving with the same careful deliberation as before. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street. More neighbors had emerged from their homes, curious about the repeated police presence on their quiet street. "Spread your hands on the hood," Reynolds ordered, his voice loud enough to carry to the small audience that was forming. Samuel looked at him directly for the first time. "May I ask why, sir?" "I don't believe I've broken any laws." Reynolds stepped closer, invading Samuel's personal space. "You made an illegal lane change back there, and I'm starting to think you might be impaired. Your slow driving, your hesitation at stops, something's not right." Both men knew these were fabrications, but only one had the badge and gun to enforce his version of reality. With dignified movements, Samuel placed his hands on the hood as instructed. The metal felt warm beneath his palms, still holding the day's heat. "I'm going to pat you down for weapons," Reynolds announced, again projecting his voice for the benefit of onlookers. As the officer roughly checked his pockets and ran hands along his legs, Samuel caught the eye of a middle-aged woman watching from her driveway across the street. She had her phone out, pointed in their direction. Samuel gave her a small nod of gratitude. Witnesses and recordings had become the modern shield for encounters like these. "Where exactly did you serve?" Reynolds asked suddenly, his tone making it clear he expected to catch Samuel in a lie. "You mentioned Vietnam earlier." "Yes, sir. I served 2 tours with the Air Force, 1966 to 1970. Samuel replied calmly. "Air Force?" Reynolds scoffed. "Sitting behind a desk while real soldiers fought?" Samuel took a slow, measured breath. "No, sir. I flew rescue helicopters, extracted wounded soldiers from combat zones." Reynolds straightened up, having found nothing in his search. "That right? What unit?" 40th Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Squadron, based out of Udorn Royal Thai Air Force Base. Samuel answered without hesitation. "We ran missions into North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia." For a brief moment, Reynolds seemed taken aback by the specificity of the answer. But his skepticism quickly returned. Convenient how you old guys all claim to be heroes when no one's around to verify. By now, several neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk opposite them, watching the interaction with growing concern. A gray-haired man in a golf shirt stepped forward slightly. "Is everything okay over there?" he called out. Reynolds turned, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. "Police business, sir. Please step back." The neighbor hesitated but didn't retreat. "Just checking. We look out for each other in this neighborhood." The implied message wasn't lost on Reynolds, but it didn't deter him. He turned his attention back to Samuel. "Open your trunk," he demanded. "May I ask why, Officer Reynolds?" Samuel's voice remained respectful, but a new firmness had entered it. "Because I'm telling you to," Reynolds snapped. "Or would you prefer I call for backup?" Samuel reached slowly into his pocket for his keys. As he did, Reynolds tensed, his hand again moving toward his weapon. "Just getting my keys, sir," Samuel said, his voice deliberately calm and even. He extracted them with 2 fingers, making sure his movements were clearly visible. As Samuel moved to the back of the car, he noticed more people had stopped to watch. A young couple pushing a stroller had paused their evening walk. An older man walking his dog stood with his arms crossed, disapproval evident on his face. A teenage boy had joined the woman with the phone, his own device now recording the scene as well. Samuel unlocked the trunk and stepped aside. Inside was a neatly organized space containing a few items, a small cooler that had held snacks for his grandchildren, a folded blanket for outdoor picnics, a toolbox, and a garment bag hanging from the hook. Reynolds rummaged through the contents roughly, unzipping the garment bag to reveal a formal military dress uniform with visible decorations. "This supposed to be yours too?" he asked with undisguised skepticism. "Yes, sir," Samuel replied. "I'm speaking at a veterans event next week." Reynolds zipped the bag closed with unnecessary force. "Seems like you're trying awfully hard to sell this veteran story." The comment stung, but Samuel kept his expression neutral. His service wasn't a story. It was written in the nightmares that still occasionally woke him, in the scars hidden beneath his clothing, in the friends whose names he had traced on the memorial wall in Washington. "Is there anything specific you're looking for, officer?" Samuel asked, his patience remarkable but not unlimited. Reynolds slammed the trunk shut. "Great, you said your son lives around here? Let's go check. Get back in your car and follow me." A murmur ran through the small crowd of neighbors. The request was unusual and seemed designed to embarrass and intimidate, rather than serve any legitimate law enforcement purpose. "Officer Reynolds," Samuel said, his voice quiet but firm, "I've provided all my identification. I've allowed you to search my person and my vehicle without a warrant. I've answered your questions truthfully and respectfully. I don't believe I'm legally obligated to lead you to my family's home." Reynolds's face flushed with anger at having his authority questioned. "You refusing to comply with an officer's instructions?" "No, sir," Samuel replied evenly. "I'm simply asking for clarification on why you need to follow me to my son's house when I've already provided identification confirming who I am." The standoff drew more attention. A woman in nursing scrubs had joined the spectators, whispering to the man with the dog. He nodded and pulled out his phone, appearing to make a call. Reynolds stepped closer to Samuel, lowering his voice. "Look, I'm trying to keep this neighborhood safe. We've had reports of break-ins, and I see an unfamiliar vehicle driving suspiciously slow through these streets. Do you understand why that raises concerns?" "I understand your duty to protect this community, officer," Samuel replied. "But I hope you understand that driving cautiously and visiting family are not suspicious activities, regardless of who is doing them." The subtext was clear to both men, and to many of the watching neighbors. This wasn't about driving habits or break-ins. This was about who belonged in this neighborhood and who didn't. Reynolds's radio crackled with a dispatcher's voice requesting his location and status. He stepped away to respond, giving Samuel a moment to collect himself. The older man who had spoken earlier approached cautiously, keeping a respectful distance. "You okay, sir?" he asked in a low voice. Samuel nodded slightly. "Been through worse." The man looked uncomfortable. "This isn't right. This isn't what our neighborhood is about." Before Samuel could respond, Reynolds returned, his demeanor changed. The radio call seemed to have reminded him that he was in public being watched, and his actions would be scrutinized. "Mr. Johnson," he said, using Samuel's name for the first time, "I'm going to let you go with a warning about that lane change. Drive carefully." He handed back Samuel's license and registration, which he had kept from the first stop. Samuel accepted them with a steady hand, his expression giving away nothing of the relief and lingering anger he felt. "Thank you, Officer Reynolds," he said, his dignity intact. "I hope you have a good evening." As Samuel turned to return to his car, he heard a new voice, firm, female, and unmistakably authoritative. "Officer Reynolds? A word, please." Samuel glanced back to see a tall black woman in her 50s approaching from across the street. She wore casual clothes, jeans, and a light sweater, but carried herself with the unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to command. Several neighbors greeted her with obvious respect, and Reynolds's posture stiffened slightly. "Dr. Wilson," Reynolds acknowledged, his tone suddenly professional. "What can I do for you?" The woman, Dr. Wilson, glanced at Samuel with a warm smile before turning her attention back to the officer. "I believe you've been speaking with my friend here," she said, her voice pleasant but with steel underneath. "May I ask what seems to be the problem?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "Just a routine traffic stop, ma'am." "Already resolved." Dr. Wilson nodded, her expression making it clear she didn't entirely believe him. "Wonderful. Then you won't mind if I have a quick word with Mr. Johnson? We haven't seen each other in a while. Without waiting for permission, she turned to Samuel and extended her hand. Good to see you again, sir. I believe the last time was at the school's Veterans Day program. Recognition dawned in Samuel's eyes as he shook her hand. He had spoken at the local high school several months back, a program for students about service and sacrifice. This woman had introduced him. She was Dr. Wilson, he said warmly, the high school principal. Yes, I remember well. Those students asked such thoughtful questions. She nodded, keeping her hand on his arm in a gesture that was both friendly and protective. They still talk about your presentation, you know. In fact, I was hoping to invite you back this year. Reynolds watched this exchange with growing discomfort, the dynamics of the situation shifting beneath his feet. Dr. Wilson turned back to him with a pleasant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Officer Reynolds, I wonder if you're fully acquainted with who you've been speaking with. Dr. Wilson's question hung in the air between them. Officer Reynolds shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing between the high school principal and Samuel. I'm familiar with Mr. Johnson's identification, Reynolds replied stiffly. We've had our discussion about his driving habits. Dr. Wilson smiled, but there was something resolute in her expression. I see. Well, perhaps I can fill in some gaps for you. She turned toward Samuel with genuine respect in her eyes. Would you mind, sir? Or would you prefer I not say anything? Samuel considered for a moment, then gave a small nod. It's fine, Dr. Wilson, though I've never been one to make a fuss about such things. She squeezed his arm gently before turning back to Officer Reynolds. This gentleman you've been questioning is retired General Samuel Johnson. He flew over 70 combat rescue missions in Vietnam, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross and Silver Star for valor. Reynolds blinked, his expression changing from dismissive to uncertain. General? Yes, Dr. Wilson continued, her voice carrying to the small crowd that had gathered. General Johnson commanded the 8th Special Operations Wing before his retirement. He's also the recipient of the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration, awarded personally by President Nixon in 1971. The murmurs among the neighbors grew louder. The man with the dog stepped forward, looking at Samuel with newfound recognition. Wait, you're that General Johnson? The one who landed under heavy fire to rescue that trapped platoon. My brother served in Vietnam. He told me that story. Samuel looked down briefly, a gesture of modesty rather than embarrassment. It was a team effort. Every man on my helicopter deserved recognition. The man extended his hand. Bill Porter. It's an honor to meet you, sir. My brother might not have made it home if not for pilots like you. Samuel shook his hand firmly. Thank you, Mr. Porter. I'm glad your brother returned safely. Officer Reynolds stood frozen, his face a complex mixture of emotions. The confident authority he'd projected minutes earlier was rapidly crumbling as the reality of who he'd been harassing became clear. Dr. Wilson wasn't finished. General Johnson sits on the Veterans Affairs Advisory Board and regularly speaks to our students about service and sacrifice. He's consulted with 3 administrations on military matters and oversees a foundation that provides college scholarships to the children of fallen service members. A woman stepped out from the gathering crowd. He mentors at the youth center downtown too. My nephew goes there. Says General Johnson is the reason he's staying in school and considering the Air Force Academy. Samuel looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention. I just try to be useful. Those young people have so much potential. Reynolds had visibly paled, his hand no longer resting near his weapon. Sir, He also happens to be my father-in-law, came a new voice. A well-dressed black man in his 40s walked briskly down the sidewalk toward the group. Thomas Johnson. He introduced himself to Reynolds with a cold formality. Hospital administrator at County General. Is there a problem with my father? Reynolds swallowed hard. No, sir. Just a routine traffic stop. 2 routine stops in the span of 10 minutes? Thomas asked, his tone making it clear he didn't believe it for a second. My wife called. Said our neighbor texted her about police harassment happening right outside our subdivision. The young couple with the stroller had moved closer. The woman spoke up hesitantly. We saw most of it. The officer made him get out of his car twice, searched him, went through his trunk. I was just doing my job, Reynolds said defensively, though his voice lacked conviction. There have been reports of suspicious activity in the area. Thomas nodded slowly, his expression controlled but his eyes flashing with anger. And my 78-year-old father, driving home from visiting his grandchildren, fit your profile of suspicious activity? Reynolds had no good answer for that. The crowd had grown to nearly a dozen people now, and the mood was unmistakably against him. Several phones were recording, capturing his discomfort and confusion. An older woman pushed her way through the gathered neighbors. She walked with a cane but moved with determination. General Johnson, Agnes Brown from the library board. I thought that was you. Did you bring those books my grandson asked about? Samuel smiled warmly at her. They're in the car, Mrs. Brown. Historical aircraft design as he requested. He has a good mind for engineering. She beamed with grandmother's pride. That he does. Thanks to your encouragement. She turned toward Reynolds, her expression hardening. Young man, do you know who you're dealing with? This gentleman helped establish our community center and raised half the funds for the new library wing. Reynolds looked increasingly uncomfortable as more neighbors approached, each with a story about Samuel's contributions to the community. A retired firefighter mentioned how Samuel had organized aid when his house burned down. A young woman recalled how Samuel had paid for her textbooks when she couldn't afford them for college. Through it all, Samuel stood with quiet dignity, occasionally trying to deflect the praise but mostly listening with grateful humility. His son Thomas stayed by his side, a protective presence though no protection was needed now. Dr. Wilson watched the scene with satisfaction before addressing Reynolds again. Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. General Johnson is not only a distinguished resident of our community, but a national hero whose service to this country most of us can only aspire to match. Reynolds removed his hat, a gesture of respect that came too late. Sir, There seems to have been a miscommunication. I apologize for the inconvenience. Samuel studied the young officer's face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by genuine embarrassment and perhaps a touch of shame. He'd seen this transformation before, the moment when someone realized they had misjudged him based solely on his appearance. We all make assumptions, Officer Reynolds, Samuel said quietly. The important thing is what we learn from them. Thomas was less forgiving. I'd like your badge number and the name of your supervisor. This type of harassment can't go unchallenged. Reynolds nodded, resigned. Yes, sir. I understand. From the edge of the crowd, a police cruiser pulled up, its lights off. The door opened and a middle-aged black man with captain's bars on his uniform stepped out. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye before approaching. Captain Howard, he introduced himself to the group. I received several calls from concerned citizens about a situation here. Is there a problem? Before Reynolds could speak, Samuel stepped forward and extended his hand. Captain, I'm Samuel Johnson. There was a misunderstanding, but I believe we're working through it. The captain shook Samuel's hand, recognition dawning on his face. General Johnson, I attended your lecture at the War College in '98. Your analysis of aerial rescue operations changed our approach to training. Samuel smiled. I remember. You asked excellent questions about risk assessment protocols. Captain Howard beamed at the recognition, before turning to Reynolds with a considerably cooler expression. Officer, a word? As the two officers stepped aside for a private conversation, Thomas put his arm around his father's shoulders. Dad, are you okay? Should we call a lawyer? Samuel shook his head slowly. I'm fine, son. Not the first time, won't be the last, but I think perhaps this young officer might learn something today. Sometimes that's the best we can hope for. Dr. Wilson joined them, concern evident in her expression. General, this is unacceptable. We can file a formal complaint. Let me think about it, Samuel replied. Right now, I'd just like to get home and rest these old bones. The gathered neighbors were reluctant to disperse, many wanting to shake Samuel's hand or share a word of support. The atmosphere had transformed from tense confrontation to something like an impromptu community gathering. With Samuel at the center, not as a suspect, but as a respected elder, Captain Howard returned, Officer Reynolds trailing behind him looking thoroughly chastened. General Johnson, on behalf of the department, I want to apologize for any inconvenience. Officer Reynolds will be filing a full report on this incident, and I'll be reviewing it personally. Reynolds stepped forward, struggling to meet Samuel's eyes. Sir, He paused, seemingly at a loss for words. Samuel studied the young officer's face and saw something there, perhaps the first glimmer of recognition, of seeing beyond his own preconceptions. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a beginning. "We all have work to do, Officer Reynolds," Samuel said quietly. "Every single one of us." Word of the incident spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the following morning, Captain Howard's phone was ringing non-stop. Concerned citizens, community leaders, and local officials all wanted to know what actions would be taken regarding Officer Reynolds' behavior toward General Johnson. Reynolds sat in the captain's office, staring at his hands. The previous day's events kept replaying in his mind, each moment more uncomfortable than the last. The contempt in his voice when he'd questioned Samuel's military service. The casual dismissal of the old man's dignity. The assumption of guilt without cause. All of it now viewed through the sobering lens of knowing exactly who Samuel Johnson was. "I've got the mayor on line 2, Captain Howard said, hanging up another call, "and 3 messages from the city council. The video's been shared hundreds of times already." Reynolds looked up. "Video?" Howard turned his computer monitor so Reynolds could see. There it was, high-definition footage of the entire second encounter from multiple angles. Reynolds' aggressive posture, his dismissive tone, Samuel's unwavering dignity, the revelation of the general's identity and accomplishments, Reynolds' own face as realization dawned. "I didn't know who he was," Reynolds said weakly. Captain Howard leaned back in his chair, studying the younger officer. "That's exactly the problem, Reynolds. You shouldn't have to know someone is a decorated war hero to treat them with basic respect." Reynolds had no response to that. "The department has a decision to make," Howard continued. "The easy path would be to make you the scapegoat. Terminate your employment, issue a public statement distancing ourselves from your actions, and hope the whole thing blows over." Reynolds paled. 3 years on the force, his career potentially over because of one traffic stop. "But," Howard continued, "I just got off the phone with General Johnson, and he's proposed something different." "Sir?" Howard pushed a piece of paper across the desk. "He's requested a community dialogue session at the church downtown. You, him, community leaders, and interested citizens. An open conversation about policing, respect, and racial bias. He specifically asked that you participate." Reynolds stared at the paper. "He wants me there? Why not just file a complaint?" He said, and I quote, "Punishment without education changes nothing." Howard studied Reynolds' face. "The general believes in second chances, apparently. Question is, do you deserve one?" Reynolds looked back at the video playing silently on the monitor, at his own face twisted with unwarranted suspicion, at Samuel's patient dignity. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. Samuel sat in his son's living room surrounded by family. Thomas paced back and forth, still agitated from the previous day's events. His wife, Lisa, sat beside Samuel on the sofa, her hand resting protectively on his. "You should press charges," Thomas insisted. "File a formal complaint at minimum. That officer had no right." "I know what my rights are, son," Samuel interrupted gently. "I've been defending them one way or another for nearly 8 decades. "Then why not hold him accountable?" Thomas demanded. "You have the influence, the standing." "People would listen." Samuel sighed deeply. "Accountability isn't just about punishment. Sometimes it's about growth." He looked at his grandchildren playing in the corner of the room, blissfully unaware of the adults' conversation. "What would it teach those little ones if my response to ignorance is merely retribution?" Lisa squeezed his hand. "You always see the bigger picture, don't you?" Samuel smiled at her. "When you've lived as long as I have, you have to. Otherwise, you'd spend all your time being angry." His phone buzzed with a text message. It was Captain Howard, confirming that the community dialogue was scheduled for the following week. The mayor would attend, local church leaders, the police chief. And yes, Officer Reynolds had agreed to participate. He said yes, Samuel told his family, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. Thomas shook his head in amazement. "I don't understand you sometimes, Dad. That man humiliated you in public, and now you're giving him a platform?" Samuel leaned forward, wincing slightly as his arthritic knees protested the movement. "I'm not giving him a platform, son. I'm offering him education. There's a difference." He glanced again at his grandchildren. "What happened to me yesterday has happened to countless black men who didn't have medals or titles to protect them. Men who didn't have neighbors recording the encounter. Men who didn't have a police captain who recognized their name." He looked up at his son, his eyes clear and determined. Change has to start somewhere. Why not with Officer Reynolds? The community hall at First Baptist Church was packed beyond capacity. People stood along the walls and spilled out into the hallway. At the front of the room, a panel had been assembled. Mayor Lewis, Police Chief Parker, Captain Howard, Reverend Washington, Dr. Wilson from the high school, Thomas Johnson, and at opposite ends of the table, Officer Reynolds and General Samuel Johnson. Reynolds felt every eye in the room on him. Many were openly hostile. Some were simply curious. He fought the urge to fidget or look down, forcing himself to sit straight in his chair. The mayor opened the session with a brief statement about community and policing, then passed the microphone to Samuel. A hush fell over the room as the elderly man adjusted his glasses and looked out at the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," Samuel began, his voice strong despite his years. "What happened the other day on Maple Avenue wasn't unique or special. It happens every day across this country to people who look like me." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The only unusual thing was that it happened to someone with enough recognition to get your attention." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "I didn't ask for this meeting to shame Officer Reynolds," Samuel continued, glancing toward the young officer. "I asked for it because what happened is a symptom of a larger problem, one that affects all of us, whether we wear a uniform or not." He proceeded to speak for nearly 15 minutes, recounting not just the recent incident but similar experiences throughout his life. Being denied service at restaurants while in uniform during the 1960s. Being pulled over repeatedly when driving his new car in the 1970s. Being mistaken for a janitor at a military function in the 1980s despite wearing a general's stars. "These experiences don't define me," Samuel said, "but they have shaped me. They've taught me patience when I wanted to rage. They've taught me dignity when others tried to strip it away. And they've taught me that education is more powerful than punishment." He turned directly to Reynolds then. "Officer, would you share your thoughts with us?" Reynolds felt his mouth go dry as the microphone was passed to him. The room was deadly silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on his face. He had prepared remarks, carefully written and reviewed by the department's public relations team. But looking at Samuel's steady gaze, he set the paper aside. "I was wrong," he began simply. "Not just about who General Johnson is, but about who I assumed he was before I knew anything about him." His voice was quiet but carried in the silent room. "I saw an old black man driving slowly through an affluent neighborhood, and I made a series of judgments based solely on that." He paused, swallowing hard. "I've spent the past week telling myself that I was just doing my job, that I was protecting the community, that anyone would have done the same." Another pause. "But watching the video of that interaction, hearing my own voice, I can't hide behind those excuses anymore." Reynolds looked directly at Samuel. "Sir, I judged you without knowing you. I disrespected your service without verifying it. I questioned your right to be in that neighborhood, to drive your own car, to visit your own family." His voice cracked slightly. "And I did it because of what you look like, not because of anything you did." A heavy silence hung over the room. Samuel nodded once, acknowledging the admission without interrupting. "I can't undo what I did," Reynolds continued, "but I can learn from it. I can do better. And I want to." He looked out at the crowd, meeting the suspicious and angry gazes directly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to grow." Samuel reached for the microphone. "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we're here today. Not to punish, but to grow. Together." 6 months passed since that community meeting at First Baptist Church. The summer heat had given way to autumn crispness, and the trees lining Maple Avenue had turned brilliant shades of gold and red. Samuel sat on a park bench, watching his grandchildren play on the swings. Little Ellie had just turned 4 and insisted on pushing herself, her small legs pumping as she tried to go higher. James, now 7, had discovered baseball and was practicing his swing at the nearby field with his father. "Is this seat taken, sir?" Samuel looked up to see Officer Reynolds standing before him, not in uniform but in casual clothes, jeans and a faded blue sweatshirt. He looked different somehow. Less rigid. "More human, it's free," Samuel replied, gesturing to the empty space beside him. Reynolds sat down, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a moment, both men watched the children playing, comfortable in the silence. "How have you been, General?" Reynolds finally asked. "Just fine. These old bones don't care much for the coming cold, but that's nothing new." Samuel glanced at the younger man. "And yourself?" I hear things have been changing at the department. Reynolds nodded. They have. Chief Parker implemented that new training program we discussed at the community dialogue. Every officer has to complete it. 40 hours on implicit bias, community relations, and de-escalation techniques. And how's that going over? Reynolds smiled ruefully. About as well as you'd expect. Some of the older officers think it's a waste of time. Others are taking it seriously. He paused. I'm helping teach the section on community engagement now. Samuel raised an eyebrow, genuine surprise on his face. Are you? Captain Howard's idea. He said someone who's publicly faced their own biases might be more credible than someone who pretends they don't have any. Reynolds looked down at his hands. It's not easy standing in front of my colleagues talking about my mistakes. But it feels important? Samuel nodded slowly. It is important. More than you know. They fell silent again, watching as Ellie abandoned the swing and ran to the sandbox. A young white mother was there with her toddler son. The woman hesitated briefly as Ellie approached, then smiled and made room. The children began playing together immediately, sharing toys without hesitation. They don't start out biased, do they? Reynolds observed quietly. No, Samuel agreed. That's something they learn along the way. Reynolds turned to face the older man directly. I've been wanting to ask you something. Why didn't you file a complaint against me? You had every right to. Everyone expected you to. Samuel considered the question carefully. Would it have helped? It would have been justified. That's not what I asked. Samuel's voice was gentle but firm. Would it have helped? Would it have changed anything for the better? Reynolds thought about it. Probably not. I might have lost my job, but another officer with the same biases would have taken your place, Samuel finished for him. And nothing would really change. Reynolds nodded slowly. I think about that day all the time, you know. How differently it could have gone if you hadn't been who you are. That's precisely the problem, Samuel said. Dignity shouldn't be reserved for decorated generals. It should be the birthright of every human being. He gestured toward the playground where children of different colors played together. They understand that instinctively. A police cruiser drove slowly past the park and both men watched it. The officer inside waved at Reynolds, who returned the greeting. There's something else I wanted to tell you, Reynolds said after the car had passed. The department's starting a community liaison program. Officers meeting regularly with neighborhood groups, building relationships before there's trouble. He hesitated. I've been assigned to your area. Samuel studied him thoughtfully. Your choice or the captain's? Mine, Reynolds admitted. If that's okay with you. Samuel smiled slightly. More than okay. Change happens one relationship at a time, Officer Reynolds. Michael, Reynolds said. My first name is Michael. Michael, Samuel repeated with a nod of acknowledgement. Across the park, Thomas looked up from his baseball practice with James and noticed the two men talking. His expression registered surprise, then concern. He excused himself from his son and started walking in their direction. My son's coming over, Samuel warned. He might not be as forgiving as I am. Reynolds tensed visibly but stayed seated. I understand. Thomas approached, his protective instincts evident in his posture. Everything okay here, Dad? Just fine, Samuel assured him. Officer Reynolds and I were discussing the department's new community liaison program. Thomas looked skeptical. Is that right? Reynolds stood and extended his hand. Mr. Johnson, I understand if you'd rather I leave. Thomas looked at the offered hand, then at his father's calm face. After a moment's hesitation, he shook Reynolds' hand briefly. No need. I trust my father's judgment. The words carried a clear warning. Don't make him regret giving you this chance. I appreciate that, Reynolds said sincerely. Your father has taught me more than any training program could. Thomas seemed to measure the sincerity in Reynolds' face before nodding once. James was asking if Grandpa could watch his next swing. Says he's finally figured out how to hit a curveball. Samuel's face lit up with pride. I wouldn't miss it. He began to rise from the bench, moving carefully due to his arthritis. Without being asked, both younger men instinctively offered their arms for support. Thomas on one side, Reynolds on the other. Samuel accepted both with grace, allowing them to help him to his feet. The simple gesture wasn't lost on any of them. Three men from different generations and backgrounds, literally supporting one another. The first community liaison meeting is next Thursday at the library. Reynolds said as they walked toward the baseball field. Would either of you be interested in attending? I'll be there, Samuel replied without hesitation. Thomas looked surprised. Dad, you already have the veterans' dinner that night. I'll go to both, Samuel insisted. Some things are worth making time for. 1 year to the day after the incident on Maple Avenue, a dedication ceremony was held at the Police Academy Training Center. A new classroom wing had been built, specifically designed for community-oriented policing instruction. Samuel stood at the podium, ribbon-cutting scissors in hand, surrounded by city officials, police leadership, and community members. Officer Michael Reynolds stood among them, now wearing sergeant's stripes and the new insignia of the Community Relations Division. This classroom isn't just a room with desks and chairs, Samuel told the gathered crowd. It's a commitment, a promise that those who serve and protect will first seek to understand the communities they patrol, that they'll see people, not stereotypes, that they'll recognize dignity regardless of appearance. He turned to Reynolds. Sergeant, would you join me for the ribbon cutting? I believe we've both earned the right. As the two men stood together, their hands sharing the ceremonial scissors, a photographer from the local newspaper captured the moment. The photo would later win a regional journalism award. The elderly black general and the young white officer, united in purpose, cutting the ribbon on a new beginning. Later that evening, as Samuel prepared to leave, Reynolds approached him one last time. I've been meaning to give you something, the officer said, handing Samuel a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a photograph, Reynolds's Police Academy graduation picture. I wrote this for my future children, Reynolds explained quietly. So they'll know the story of how I met you, what I learned, and how it changed me. I thought you might want a copy. Samuel read the letter slowly, his eyes growing misty. Thank you for this, Michael. It means more than you know. No, sir, Reynolds replied earnestly. Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving when everyone else just saw something worth punishing. Samuel placed his hand on the younger man's shoulder. That's the thing about truly seeing people, Officer Reynolds. Sometimes they surprise you. As Samuel drove home that evening, he took the long route down Maple Avenue. The street looked different now, not just because of the season's change, but because of what had happened there. A place of humiliation had become a catalyst for transformation. He drove exactly the speed limit, not because he feared being pulled over, but because he had nothing to prove and nowhere to rush to. The neighborhood that had once seemed hostile now felt like part of his community too. A police cruiser passed him going the other direction. The officer inside, a young woman he didn't recognize, gave him a respectful nod as they passed. Samuel returned it with a smile. Small steps, he thought, but steps nonetheless.